So, a few weeks back, we got information that the wizard with the next update will apparently be getting some nerfs. As per the executive producer, they say we're also going to look at wizards to ensure they're not too consistent, given the high range and effective radius on many of their powers. So we were like, what's going on here? Why do they think that to be the case? Now, I personally have done my own testing on wizards, and I've played the class for a fair amount as well, and it is overall a pretty easy class to play. Like, just to pick it up, to choose the right abilities, and overall, there's not exactly that much of a skill ceiling once you have chosen the correct setup. You will just go ahead and use your abilities when they're off cooldown pretty much. There's not much to it. You don't have like a special mechanic. You just have spell mastery, which allows you to have 4 encounter powers. And so any old player can generally pick up a wizard and just mash all the keys and do solid damage. So that could very well be why the devs are stating it's, say, too consistent, because it is pretty easy to play, it's hard to go wrong, and it's just a very reliable damage dealer. On top of that, you're ranged. You don't have to be adjacent to your enemy to output your damage. The majority of your powers are like 80-foot range, so you have a lot of flexibility on where you can position yourself in order to output your damage. You don't have to be like melee up right close to your target who could be moving around. Therefore, your time on target is super high. You can make a dummy test and you can pretty much do that damage in any content so long as you can continually attack your target. You can dodge quickly and still maintain damage because you can still attack from that new position. Versus your melee damage dealers, if they dodge away, they're going to have to come back again in order to keep attacking their target. But still, we did want some more info on this. What does that really mean? And so we did get a dev response. We can see here Brett Norton states, the general comment on consistency is we have to factor in effective uptime on powers when we consider what the real practical damage output of a class or build, etc. Classes with many ranged powers generally have more consistent effective uptime on their powers than classes with primarily melee powers. Those with very long range powers or very large area of effects can often achieve much more consistent DPS performance. A class that performs at 100 DPS 100% of the time is generally performing better than a class that performs at say 110 DPS but 80% of the time, but 0 DPS at 20% of the time. Artifact calls or burst windows make that relative comparison even trickier. So our focus in the near future is trying to achieve better parity amongst the DPS classes, as noted with Warlocks in particular. We're considering other suggestions noted here, such as changes to Tactician's Precision, etc., which we acknowledge favors classes with a lot of burst options, high damage encounters on long cooldowns. So ultimately my takeaway from this is what I was saying. The wizard is very consistent in the way it has not a very high skill ceiling with just 4 encounter powers and no special mechanic. You just use your abilities when they're off cooldown, and you can be very far away from your target and still maintain all that damage output. There's no positioning really required other than, say, having combat advantage against your target, so you just make sure you flank your enemy. But unlike a melee damage dealer, you can be situated anywhere within that 80 feet and still pretty much sustain all of your damage output. Versus a melee damage dealer has to be right close. They threaten to get hit, they have to maybe dodge a mechanic, and then they have to come back again. Which is unlike a wizard. If you just need to dodge a mechanic, you just dodge, and then you're pretty much still in a good position to continually attack. But I will say my tests on wizards did show that they're not exactly overperforming. You have melee damage dealers like Bard, somewhat Whisper Knife, and Barbarian, who can outperform it. And Cleric, I would say, is an exception of having a very high skill ceiling and does warrant having a bit more higher damage output, like a damage ceiling versus other classes as a result of that. I personally think Wizard's in a solid position and shouldn't be changed. I don't think it's a bad thing that Wizard has decent consistent damage output. Like compared to the others here again, it's like the middle of the ground, middle of the road there, at least on Thermometers, with then Arcanist actually underperforming. Arcanist is the path that has a bit of a higher skill ceiling, which could do with some improvements, and it should be an option to choose that path and require you to coordinate and rotate your powers more specifically in order to like achieve maybe a little bit better results than Thaumaturge. You should be rewarded skill with damage output. Like again, I would safely say any class above Thaumaturge here is a bit trickier to play than it. Like Bard, you have to play melee, but otherwise it is pretty much spam, spam, spam. But you do want to optimize by learning how to play your songs, which is a lot more button presses, and it is a unique mechanic compared to what Wizard has. It has nothing, it's just spam and counters. Whisper Knife, you need a super strict rotation and you have to follow it always, or you just lose out on massive amounts of damage. If you have to delay or have to play a mechanic and you screw up and you end up not having your daily power for the next artifact call, you lose a massive amount of damage. You're not very consistent there. Cleric, you need to follow a super strict rotation or your damage is just flat out terrible. And Barbarian, you're all melee. You also need to follow a pretty strict rotation or your damage will fall behind significantly. And sure, there's a lot of other issues with the other classes, and that's not to say they shouldn't get improved here, the more underperforming ones. But overall, I would safely say Wizard is fine. Yes, I don't think it's a bad thing that it's a new player-friendly class. The only thing is that, sure, it has so much utility and usefulness and reliability that people tend to favor it, at least over the past few modules, versus other classes because they can more reliably trust that a player on a Wizard can probably output okay damage versus some of the other classes. Like you get a new player playing on Wizard versus say Barbarian, and you'll find that Wizard player would probably more consistently output good damage, at least if they've chosen the right abilities, than that Barbarian. Again, just due to the nature that you are ranged, you can use your abilities from afar, and you don't have any special mechanic. You're just using your encounter powers, and that's it. So long as you keep using them when they're off cooldown, you will do good damage. But again, that's the wording we had from the devs. I think it's pretty messy, and I would prefer them honestly to balance damage more so around an ideal scenario, like a dummy test. And then you should balance fights based around the certain classes and abilities. Like you should maybe in some fights punish range damage dealers, so they have to play close like a melee damage dealer, and that would cause them to have a bit of a higher skill ceiling that they might not be used to that. And there's definitely a lot of different mechanics you can use that are going to either punish ranged or punished melee, and it doesn't have to be so punishing for those melee damage dealers as we've had in the past few modules. And if it is like that, if you do create content which is gonna be so punishing for melee, then maybe just have a flat boost for melee damage dealers in said specific content. Like if you're playing your assassin, if you're playing your barbarian, you're playing your fighter, which are like all true melee damage dealers, maybe give them a little bit of a buff. But again, we'll have to see what happens. I ultimately don't think Wizard really needs any changes right now. Could do with some bug fixes, but I think they're in a very solid position. Yes, they're very desirable because they're very new player friendly, but I don't think that's the worst thing. You can maybe make some of the other classes a bit easier to play, update some of the lower performing paragons, and just, make them not so hard to play. But overall, again, I don't see why there shouldn't be like one or two classes which are more new player friendly than others, particularly if they're not overperforming. Wizard is consistent, but it is kind of middle of the range of maximum damage output when you compare versus like a high skilled player who could play all of the classes. Wizard is not like top tier. But of course, as we did see with the original post, they will be looking at some updates for the other classes, like nerfing Rogue and Bard maybe a little bit, and improving like Rangers, Fighters, and Clerics. Along with Warlock will be obtaining a lot of improvements with this next big update, Module 30. Overall, thanks for watching. A special thank you to all these channel members for your added support. If this was somewhat insightful, consider leaving the video a like, and if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.